Thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Karen Ravago Ballarat, and I'm the Director of Alumni Professional Engagement here at the UCSB Alumni Affairs Office. Welcome to day one of the second ever Gaucho Professionals Expo. Last year we had held it in Los Angeles. This year we had planned for it to be in person in the Bay Area. And of course, you know, with everything going on, we really appreciate everyone tuning in and joining us for this virtual version. With that in mind, even though we're not physically on campus, I wanted to acknowledge that the state of California recognizes today as Indigenous Peoples Day. So we're not at UCSB right now, but we just want to recognize the history and the culture of the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which UCSB sits and where all of this great work and research is happening. So for an introduction of tonight's speaker, we have Dr. Peter Rupert with us tonight. So Professor Rupert is a professor of economics at UCSB, former chair of the economics department, director of the UCSB Economic Forecast Project, amongst a million other things. In Santa Barbara, he sits on the mayor's task force on reopening, and during the pandemic, he's been giving presentations on COVID-19 and its effects on education, real estate, tourism, the local economy, etc. And Professor Rupert actually did one of these presentations for me back in May. And at the time we were calling it a post-COVID talk. So that's what we were thinking in May. So I'm excited to hear his take on, where we are all these months later. So just a quick reminder that everyone is on mute right now, but feel free to turn your camera on if you'd like so that we can see you out in the audience. We'll leave some time for Q&A at the end of the presentation, so feel free to use the chat box to submit any questions. But for now, I will turn it over to Professor Rupert. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Karen. Appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to everyone today. This talk is really going to be about, obviously, what's gone on since the shutdown and the pandemic. I think that there's still a lot out there that we don't know. There's some things we do know, and I want to be careful when I say that it's this has become very political, obviously, and I'm staying out of the political realm, as I always do. This is purely going to be some data we're going to look at. And as Karen mentioned, we'll save some time for questions at the end. So, feel free to hold those. So put them in the chat. So, the idea is, so I like this little cartoon, who led the digital transformation of your company? The CEO, the CIO or CTO, COVID-19. And obviously we've seen a lot of changes since COVID struck and we all had to start working remotely. It's crazy hard, I think, engaging a lot of people through Zoom. I think we do the best we can. The university has really put a lot of effort into making sure that we're getting to the students properly, that they're getting the education they need. And I think it's going well so far. In the end, we'll see. So we'll talk about a little bit that later. So anyway, it's really COVID-19 who's going to lead a lot of the technical digital transformation of companies. So my question to you guys, and you can think about this, maybe we'll vote later on, what are we going to call this at the end of the day? Remember, we had a great recession. We had a depression back in 1929 to 33. So what are we going to call this one? I have put a few up here. A synthetic recession. Why do I want to say synthetic recession? I want to say this is a synthetic recession mainly because the economy didn't cause this. COVID-19 caused this, and we were shut down by the government rather than businesses closing on their own or hiring fewer people, due to downturn in activity, whatever. So synthetic recession's one. The Great Suppression. So obviously we've been suppressed. We haven't had the opportunity to really get out there and work. My favorite, of course, is SmackDown 2020, like in the World Wrestling Federation. We were really smacked down hard by the government. And I'm going to show you some pictures that, I think are going to, make you realize, just how big this thing really is. And then the question is, how fast and what tools are we going to use to get back? So what's the difference really between this and a standard recession? So I'll tell you that there is no standard definition of a recession, and many people are under the assumption that if there's 2 quarters in a row of a decline in GDP, that constitutes a recession. That's false. The recessions are called by a group of individuals, economists, from the National Bureau of Economic Research, and they get together from time to time and they talk about how the economy is going. And when they call out a recession, and by the way, they look at many, many things, just not GDP. They look at the employment, they look at things like bankruptcies, all kinds of things. And, so what they do is they say, you know what, I think we entered a recession 6 months ago. They don't call it concurrently. What they do is they say 6 months ago, we entered a recession. And then 4 or 5 months after the recession ends, to us, they then come out with a statement saying, oh, the recession's over. And I'll show you a picture of what that looks like. So why does it matter? It matters because, can we use the same kind of tools as we would for a standard recession? And everybody knows the Federal Reserve does lots of things. The federal government does lots of things during a recession. We have a lot of automatic stabilizers that happen during a recession. And so the question is, are those tools appropriate for the things we're seeing today? And secondly, how is it we're going to recover? And this is going to be very, very different than what we've seen before. And what I meant by how are we going to recover, even if the government tomorrow told everybody, okay, no one has to wear masks, everything's open, do whatever you want. I want each of you to think about, am I going to go to the gym tomorrow? Am I going to go to a crowded bar like I used to? Am I going to go to a restaurant? Am I going to fly somewhere? Am I going to go to a conference with 300 people, standing next to each other? So those are the kind of things you have to think about. And to me, the economy will open when we say it's going to open, when we're ready and feel safe and comfortable. And that's going to be up to businesses to make sure that we feel safe and comfortable. And if you talk to people today who are flying, many of them do feel safe and comfortable. The airport's doing a great job. Certain airlines don't have middle seats. They just, they don't fill the middle seats. They're flying at low capacity. Of course, that hurts them. But, everybody's kind of trying to do their share. But what I always try to do in some of these talks is, it's not a doom and gloom scenario for everyone, and I want you to keep this in mind. And, so what is this thing? So this is a picture of real per capita GDP. Now, what I always tell my students, whether they're PhD students or undergrads, I tell them, when you see a graph, I want you to actually look at the graph. Don't just look at the lines. I want you to look at it carefully. So number one, what's the title? Real per capita GDP. Every time you see an economist put the word real, that means we've gotten rid of inflation. Per capita means this is per person GDP. What do? We take gross domestic product or gross domestic income and we divide it by every person in the United States. So that's per capita GDP. Now, if you look towards over here, you'll see it says the log. Many of you probably forgot logarithms, back in the day, but we take logarithms for a very particular reason, which I'll show you. Whoops. So now you can see I put here GDP in blue and a linear trend in red. These bluish bars that you see, these are recessions. These are US recessions going all the way back to 1947. So you can see what recessions look like, about how long they are. You can see the Great Recession was not the longest recession we ever had, even though its effects have been felt for a very long period of time. And then you can see now I've put in, this thing called linear trend. So why have I done that? So what this means is this linear trend, this red line, it basically says that this is the growth rate of your income, of real gross domestic product or income on average across the United States. And what it's telling you is that it grows by about 2 to 3% every year. That's what this red linear trend means. It means every year we get 2 to 3% richer on average. Now, one thing I try to do I don't tell this to everybody, by the way, and it's for lots of reasons, but if you tell me who your least favorite president since 1947 is, or who your favorite president since 1947 is, you know, it's kind of hard to pick these things out in these graphs. You see a bunch of wiggles around a red line. So sometimes we're above trend. And by the way, a president could enter while we're above trend, up here, for example. And if the president enters at that time and they're above trend, it looks like they do well. And you can see that whoever was president here, you know, we were below trend. So that means that GDP was falling and it was below our trend. Here you can see there's periods of time, you know, this is basically 10 years where we were pretty much above our long run trend. And the same thing happened in the 80s, which are really boom times, and going into the 90s. However, now what you see, and this is what's very problematic, is we've fallen below trend, this linear trend, which means our gross domestic product is not growing, or your income is not growing as fast as it typically has in the course of the last 70 or 80 years. And now you can see this is the pandemic. Before the pandemic, we were already off this trend line. And many people said after the Great Recession that we ended up having a new paradigm, a new way that we're behaving, and we're never going to get back to this trend. I don't believe that. I believe we will get back to this trend. And during the Q&A, maybe we can talk more about why I might believe that. So what has COVID done? Well, as I mentioned, the economy was shut down by fiat. That is just by government decision. All what we called non-essential businesses were closed. Obviously, non-essential is a subjective term to many of us. You know, for me, I wasn't happy that they closed some bars, but you know, there you go. Some of these businesses were hit much harder than others. So the businesses that were hit very hard were businesses that had many types of personal in-person communication, whether it's things like salons, gyms, bars, restaurants, retail. All of these things ended up being non-essential at some level. So now let me just show you what this looks like. And this is, you know, this graph is going to change the way we look at data, by the way. So this goes back to 1939. This is the monthly employment change. And if I showed you this graph, you would say, wow, the change in employment is like almost around zero. It hardly moves across zero. If we looked at this graph before January, it would be a much, much different looking graph. That is, these things would be really big movements. And the reason is that in order for us to have captured the pandemic here, you can see that we lost about 20 million people in 1 month who lost employment. We have never seen anything like that in the history of the United States. Now, it turns out that after that, it came back pretty quickly. We'll discuss why. And you can see even during the Great Recession, this was a tiny little wiggle when you look at it through the lens of being so far away to incorporate this point we have here going down to 20 million. So this is going to change, you know, if I showed you this graph without the pandemic, again, you would see these big changes. And one example is something like this, again. So this is just the same data I just showed, but now what I've done is I have looked at this in a bar chart and just going back to May of 2019. And again, you can see that, you know, these were pretty good months. 182,000 increase, 194, 207. These are pretty good monthly changes in employment. But of course, you can't really see like it looks very much now because it's swamped by this 20.7 million decline in employment. Since then, by the way, since April, you can see we've come back a little bit. This is 2,700,000 people coming back to work. Again, swamping everything we've ever seen. The next month, 4.7 million people coming back to work. And then since then, it's been falling. But look, once many, many people are back at work, we don't expect these numbers to be like in the millions. And when we get back to what we're going to call normal, we're going to be somewhere here in the 200,000 range, if we're lucky. I mentioned what got really hurt is retail employment. So why did retail employment get hurt so much? Well, the federal government said, guess what? We're closing down stores. You've got to close your store. It's very easy for retail stores to fire people, right? They just say, look, we're done. You can't come in. So they basically got rid of 2.4 million workers in a month. And again, this is a very, very big number, something obviously we've never seen before. And then you can see after that, you know, it increased by stuff we've never seen before. And now we're down here, you know, basically getting back to sort of where we were before. No, we're not there yet, obviously. This now looks at a bar chart, but again, just showing you, you know, that in order to, again, to capture this huge decline in retail, you know, we have to make the graph go down to over 2 million. And what I would really like to do is, right, just get rid of all this and get back to normal that people are a little more used to. And again, that's the same looking picture for retail employment change. Now, I remember when I told you guys should be looking at the graph and seeing what's on it. This is the change in employment. It's in thousands. Maybe you didn't even notice this part here. It's in thousands and it's seasonally adjusted. I'm going to talk about seasonal adjustment in just a second, and the problems that that has become due to the fact of our season are much different now because of the pandemic, and it's going to matter, and I'll show you where it matters. This is the second part that really got hurt, leisure hospitality. Obviously, you can see 7.5 million people lost their job in 1 month. Since then, we've been coming back a bit. But again, these are bars and restaurants, hotels, you know, places that, again, easy to think about closing. And then once they're closed, you just get rid of your employees. Now, what's bad about that, and what the CARES program that the government instituted and PPP was to try to keep a lot of these people, you know, employed by the same employer. And the reason is that many of these connections you want to keep permanent. You might like the employees. You might don't want them to leave to look for another job when the pandemic is over. So the government was encouraging people through the CARES program and PPP to keep paying people even though they weren't actually at work. So where do these people go that left? Well, some of them left the labor force completely. Some of them just dropped out. It's like, there's no sense, I'm already unemployed. I don't think there are jobs out there, so I'm not going to look. They become what are called marginally attached people. They would like to have a job if they thought they were out there, but they don't even search. One thing about unemployment, the definition is you have to be actually searching, physically searching for a job. You can't be sitting at home hoping that somebody knocks on the door to give you a job. You actually need to be out there, you know, pounding the streets or going through employment agencies, whatever. So you have to be searching. The declines in employment are certainly not evenly distributed. The answer is there are the people that got hit, and if you just thought for a second when I told you, who is it that got hit? Retail, leisure and hospitality. These are waiters, waitresses, people who work in, you know, in bars, you know, et cetera. Retail employment, all pretty much lower income individuals. That's who makes up that sector. So this is what weekly initial claims look like. And this just goes back to 2007. And again, the blue bars are recession dates. And you can see in February, the National Bureau of Economic Research in February of 2020 said we're in a recession. Note that was before we closed because of the pandemic. There was already some signs that the economy was slowing and maybe even entering a little bit of a recessionary time period. The pandemic just obviously sped that up. It wasn't clear whether we were going to enter a recession or not if it weren't for the pandemic, but that just blows things out of the water. So what you can see again is this thing called weekly initial claims. This comes out every Thursday. You can look at it. Unemployment insurance systems are run by the state governments. This comes from the U.S. Employment and Training Administration, who they report to. And they say, and you can see here, you know, in 1 week, there were 7 million people who claimed initial unemployment. So what happens when you become unemployed? Well, like I said, you could leave the labor force, fine, or you go to your state unemployment office and you say, I have been let go from my job, I've been fired. You can't quit. You have to be let go, a layoff, fired, whatever. You can't quit and then just get unemployment insurance. So this says back here in April that around 7 million people went to their state's unemployment insurance agency and claimed unemployment. By the way, they don't all get it. You have to qualify to get it. So these people who went to do initial claims, they don't necessarily get unemployment insurance. So these aren't the people who are necessarily covered in getting the unemployment insurance. And then you can see over the next few weeks, it fell. Now it's still higher than any time we've ever seen, pretty much in the history of this series. Going back to the Great Recession, you can see that it's about twice the height of the Great Recession. So this is massive, what we've seen. So now, this again is a similar looking thing, but with a bar. So these are weekly initial claims. Note again here, I put seasonally adjusted. Now, why am I making a big deal about seasonal adjustment? If you're trying to understand what's going on in the economy, what's going on with, is the economy getting better, getting worse? The reason the government seasonally adjusts most data, and by the way, when the government puts data out, it's almost always seasonally adjusted. So why is that? You want to think about, take Christmas, for example. You wouldn't want to say, wow, our economy's booming because we hired more people during December. Well, no, right? We know why they hired more people is because Christmas. So what you really want to do is you want to compare this Christmas to last Christmas, for example. Are we having a better Christmas season? You can't tell that by going from November to December unless you knew what normally happens going between November and December. And that's what seasonal adjustment does. Now, I bring that up because if you go back, which I did, and looked at a lot of these data, you will see that from time to time, news reporters, or big names too, Forbes, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, you name it, they would say things like, if you look between September 5th and September 12th here, you will see that seasonally adjusted, it fell. Then you can see the next month, going from September 12th to 19th, that seasonally adjusted, there were more people. So what a lot of people said was, whoa, we thought we were done with this. We thought this was going to keep declining week after week. So now if you look at the next picture, these are not seasonally adjusted. And so not seasonally adjusted gives a slightly different pattern. That is, you can see recently, we actually increased the number of initial claims. Why not seasonally adjusted? These are actually the number of people who made claims, and they don't adjust it. This is just the raw number of people who made claims. And you can see it's kind of gone up and down. August, it fell in August 22nd, went back up a little bit, went up, went down, went up, went down. And if you seasonally adjust this with prior history, you're not making the right adjustment. So why is that? It's because normally in August, during the summer, when students graduate, unemployment typically rises. That's because new entrants are looking for jobs. So what they say is relatively, 5% more people during the summer look for jobs. So the seasonal adjustment adds a factor. Now, I've written a couple things about this on my blog, which you can find in Econ Snapshot, by the way. And what I basically said was, the seasonal adjusted data is not telling the story that most people want to be told. That is, are more people claiming unemployment insurance or fewer? And that's what this is telling you. And once you adjust it, you now don't really know the number of people who are actually claiming it. Not a big deal. It's just going to matter how you interpret some of the data. This next slide is called continued claims. Continued claims are, once you make an initial unemployment insurance claim, if you receive the unemployment insurance, then the next week you're called a continuing claim. You have to go back to your unemployment insurance office and say, I got unemployment insurance, I'm still unemployed, and you're a continued claim. So now what you can see is very, very quickly, we went up to over 24 million people who were getting unemployment insurance. 24 million people were getting unemployment insurance. Remember, that was unemployment rates of going up at over 20%. You can see what happened during the Great Recession. We went from about 3.5 million people up to about 7. That was it. That was huge until we look at what's happened today. And again, this is continued claims. The same story holds true for seasonally adjusted data versus not seasonally adjusted data. So, as I mentioned, there were very uneven job losses. So one way to tell, and this is, I think, very, very, kind of a nice metric to see who lost their jobs. So who are the hardest hit sectors? I told you, retail, leisure and hospitality. Those are very low income. And by the way, I put here, hint, does minimum wage ring a bell? So if we look at, so again, looking at the graph, this is wages and inflation. The blue line are average hourly earnings, the year over year percent change. So again, if it's 3%, it means you made 3% more this year than last year. Note to self, there is no word real here. And the reason there was no real is these are nominal. These are just not taking into account inflation. So I put the red line. The red line is inflation. Every time the blue line is above the red line, your earnings in real terms are higher. That is, your earnings went up more than inflation did. And every time the red line's above the blue line, your earnings actually fell. So even here back in 2011, you can see that wage growth was about 2%, but inflation was 3%. That means you were 1% poorer over the year because inflation eroded your 2% earnings. So now you can see what happened to average hourly earnings. It popped up like crazy. Again, we don't see numbers like this. It grew by 8% in 1 month, average hourly earnings. And the question is, wow, is it because we were so much more productive when the pandemic hit? The answer is no. The reason it jumped up like that is because all of the low income people were fired. And so what this graph shows you is there's a selection. What we're now looking at up here is average hourly earnings for those people who are employed. And we got rid of all the lower income minimum wage workers, which means the average is higher. So this is just a picture to show you that, the people who lost their jobs were low income. And now that we have started to hire them back, average hourly earnings are falling. And you can see they never fall by this much typically. You can see up here, these are probably the highest real earnings we have seen. Again, this is a selection issue, but this is 8%. Inflation was only, less than 1%. So that means 7% in real terms growth. Again, that's one of my favorite graphs. I'll pause for a moment so you can let this information sink in. That's what economists do, right? And all these people, they throw up 1,000 graphs and think you're going to remember them. Not, but anyway. So were we prepared for this? Nope, we certainly weren't medically. We should have been. There was many warnings. I'll explain that in a second. Economically, were we prepared for it? Well, compared to the Great Recession, we were actually pretty well prepared for something like a big recession or a depression or a pandemic. And what this graph shows is, this is debt to equity for non-financial corporations. And you can see back in the 1980s, there was a huge amount of debt compared to equity. During the it fell dramatically over the next 10 years. And then you can see during the Great Recession, the debt to equity ratio was pretty much as high as it's been outside of the 1970s. And after that, maybe people were scared. Maybe businesses were like, we better be careful. We shouldn't go into too much debt. It fell. And here we were kind of at the lowest we've been in a long time in terms of debt to equity. So much less debt, which means businesses were much more able to withstand some downturn. This is households now, debt to disposable income. And again, you can see that households were building up debt. The red is just debt service. These are all the financial obligations added together. The blue line is mortgage debt. The green line is consumer debt. And you can see that most of these things have been picking up for many, many years. That is, this is the percent of debt as a percent of disposable income. You can see what happened during the pandemic, that people's debt fell a lot. That is, they realized, just like during recessions, they start saving more, they pay back some of their debt so they can move forward. And you can see we've had big declines in debt to income here. Another way to look at that, it would be the personal savings rate. This is how much people save out of their disposable income. Savings usually goes up during recessions. Savings usually go up during recessions. Why is that? People start to buy less because they know we don't know how long this is going to persist, and maybe they lose their job. Again, crazy data. We have 33% savings rate during the middle of the pandemic. 33%. Again, never seen before a number like 33%. And then as people started saying, okay, maybe we're going to get out of this, you know, it's now fallen, it's still 15%, much higher than we've seen in a long time. Have we seen all this before? The answer is, I don't have that much time left because I want to save some for questions, but have we seen this all before? The answer is yes. I will put these slides up that Karen can send to people. And if you click on these links, you will see here, notice effective Wednesday, December 11th, 1968, to safeguard our patients during the flu epidemic. This stuff basically tells you the outbreak started in China, where it quickly engulfed the city of Wuhan before racing across the globe on commercial flights and ships, eventually killing more than 1 million people worldwide and over 100,000 in the United States. This is 1968, the Hong Kong flu. So it killed over 100,000 people. And by the way, there was no lockdown. The Federal Reserve did nothing. In fact, the following year, there was a second wave, but some of you older people will remember Woodstock took place during this flu pandemic. So, you know, that's something that you have to just be aware of. And this is another, I hope, this is another one, as I showed you, that Woodstock, occurred, you know, during the middle of a pandemic. In any event, we have seen this before. 1957 to 58 was H2N2. That was the Asian flu, it was called. That flu morphed into H2N3, which became the Hong Kong flu. And as I mentioned, in 57, 58, there were 116,000 deaths in the US. And if you correct for population size, that probably means that holding population constant, that's something like 170,000 people would have died. And again, nothing was done. No masks, you know, no shutdowns. Who knows what would have happened, by the way, if they did shut down. Maybe this number would be 50,000 instead of 116,000. I will tell you to look at these links on your own time. George Bush read a book about pandemics. And in 2005, he got together at the National Institute of Health, and he held an hour-long conference on the next big problem that's going to happen in the United States is a flu pandemic. And he talked and he set up something I think called influenza.gov, where it was supposed to track all this stuff and be prepared. Barack Obama in 2014 did the same thing, an hour long about why we have to be prepared for a pandemic. Donald Trump's Council of Economic Advisors in 2019, this is September of 2019, his Council of Economic Advisors wrote a 40-page report on what's going to happen if we have a pandemic. And it looks very similar to what actually happened. So yes, we knew that this could happen. We could have been ready, we weren't. What did we do about it? CARES, payroll protection, 2.5 trillion was the first round. By the way, that's larger than the GDP of Italy, larger than the GDP of Canada. These are not small numbers, 2.5 trillion. I'm just going to tell you now. Coming up, we're going to be seeing another 1.8 trillion. Now, Social Security payments are about $1 trillion. So this is 4 times Social Security, and we thought Social Security was a problem. And this doesn't include what the Fed's been doing. This is the Federal Reserve's holdings. You can see what happened during the Great Recession, that they had to start lending to financials. And by the way, historically, the Fed has held about $800 billion in treasuries and a little bit of cash. During the Great Recession, as banks started to crumble, the Fed started lending to them. And they were worried about their balance sheet for a long time. As you can see here, they were substituting short-term debt for lending. And then after a while, they said, who gives a damn about our stupid budget, our balance sheet? Let's let it go up, 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 up. They started to come down a little bit. By the way, all this orange stuff, this is bad houses, right? This is delinquent mortgage debt that the Fed bought. And then you can see what happened during the pandemic. It's now $7 trillion when it used to be 800 billion. Never been there before. The Fed's not sure how they're going to get out of this. Of course, they always say, oh, we'll figure it out. We got smart people. They've never been here before. Forecasts are all over the map, both medical and economics. You can see the forecast all over the place. Maybe markets know something we don't know, or do we know something markets don't know? But as you know, the stock market has been going crazy, setting records, day in, day out, for whatever reasons. Maybe everyone believes the economy is not as bad because it was a shutdown by the government and we're going to come back. But for whatever reasons, you can see the stock market's gone crazy. New single housing sales. Well, you see what happened right during the Great Recession. Right before the Great Recession, housing started to collapse. And typically housing does fall before a recession. It's the first thing to start falling. And you can see how much it fell in terms of new single family sales. Started to build back up. And again, if I didn't show you this blue line, you didn't know there was a pandemic, you'd say, maybe it's fallen a little bit, but you would say no great shakes. And by the way, in Santa Barbara, residential sales have gone crazy. All the real estate agents I talked to, mortgage brokers, refinancing, title people, they all are saying that they've never seen anything like this in their 40 years of in business. So this is what I mean about forecasts and why you should, pay attention. So this comes from the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. And if you go back to January 1st, so this black line is what happened. That was like the GDP graph I showed you before. Now, suppose you're at January 1st, 2020, and you say to yourself, what's our best forecast? Remember I showed you that red line, that linear trend? That's the best forecast, given you don't know anything's going to happen in the future. So that's what they forecast going forward on January 1st, 2020, that blue dashed line. Then the pandemic hits. They say, things are going to be bad for a little while. Things got worse than they thought. Now this is their forecast. Then this is their forecast. And then this was their forecast in April. So you can see this is a huge decline, right? This is a decline of about 6%. Massive decline. Like GDP has fallen, but remember this graph. So this is that linear trend. This is the thing I showed you at the beginning. I'm an optimist at this stuff. We're going to get back on trend. We just have to make good decisions. Summary and conclusion of the COVID, it's the government, stupid. Thank you very much. And now I guess, Karen, we can have some questions. I ran a little long, I know.
No, thank you. This was, I know that you've shared with me in the past that it seems like it's doom and gloom, but we appreciate the positive perspective that you're able to offer on the current situation. To follow up on your question about the housing market, so where do you anticipate that going in the future? The housing market, the stock market, do you think they're going to fall? When? What's your take on that?
Right. So I think just like when we went through the retail decline because of technology and online sales, a lot of retailers had to rethink what they were doing. And, from that, we saw lots of declines in retail space. And many stores folded. And people were saying, that's the end of retail. Of course, that's not going to be true. Just like housing right now, everybody said, okay, everybody gets to work from home from now on. Therefore, everybody wants a bigger house. They want an extra room for a den. They want to kick their kids down into the basement where they belong, all those kind of things. There will be some of that. There will be some businesses who allow their employees to work remotely forever. I don't think every business is going to do that. I think there are lots of reasons to be in an office together. I have a friend who their son works for Spotify in New York, and Spotify said, you guys can work remotely for a year if you want. So he came back to Santa Barbara, lived with his parents for like 2 months, and he's like, I'm moving back to New York. I don't mind being crammed in an apartment with four other people. I have a social life. I have a life too. So yeah, I don't think we're going to see as big changes as people think. I think right now we're seeing a huge increase from people in LA and San Francisco and New York moving to places like Santa Barbara, Aspen, Colorado. That'll happen for a little while, I think, but I don't think we're going to see a collapse in the housing market anytime soon.
And to piggyback off of that, I was going to ask a question working in the university setting and thinking about students being virtual versus when will students be able to come back to campus. Diane asks us a question in the chat about how do you think the rush to have digital transformation will affect business and education? So what's your take on college students learning remotely and still wanting to have community? And I know we definitely see that on our campus.
Right.
So
right.
what might that look like in the future?
Part of education, while there's a lot to cognitive learning, many economists who've worked on how education affects earnings and things like that, they basically come to realize that the non-cognitive part of education is about as big as the cognitive part. So learning how to do math, learning how to program, of course, it's fantastic. Learning how to deal with the real world, having our elementary kids learn to be together, how to socialize, that should not be undervalued. And I think one of the real tragedies of this remote learning is that it's really affected lower income parts of the population a lot. People they don't have the internet connectivity that they really need. They may not have the hardware they need. And so in my view, I think we're going to see an increase in inequality, unfortunately. And I think it's very bad for us. Now, having said that, if I look on the other side at people who are better or more well off, they're forming these pods. And I think as many people have seen, 5 or 6 rich people get together, they hire a out of work teacher to come to the house and teach their 5 kids. So, so they're getting that. They're getting some socialization as well. So again, I'm just afraid that there's going to be an increase in inequality. And I think that, like I mentioned, part of growing up as an adult in the US is going away to college and, toughing it out. And it turns out, I guess kids still do this, but they like to have sex and things like that. They want to meet people. They want to go to bars. And I think that, places like University of North Carolina, I don't know who's running these schools, but they said that everything's going to be in person. So all the students come in, and then that next week, there was 137 new cases. What did they expect? Mm-hmm. What did they expect, right? Of course there's going to be more cases from that. The question is, is it bad? When it's all said and done. And then they shut down, right? And they said, no, everybody go home. So I think colleges have done a particularly bad job in universities of managing this. I think that we could have done better testing. We could have done more contact tracing, all those kind of things that University of Illinois is doing. They have 50,000 students and they're all back. Arizona State is all back. So, I think we had a very mismanaged system overall. We're not like Sweden, by the way, that, did well. We're not like Norway that did well. So why is that? Well, once the federal government said, what, states, you do whatever you want. You can shut down if you want. And then the states said to the counties, you guys do whatever you want. So we've got no system that really, now, do I want federal control of this stuff? No, but I would certainly like a little more strategy, in ways to get testing and, those things together.
That leads into Michaela's question about any examples of other countries that are doing better than us economically right now, and what are some of the things that they did well to stave off some of the economic downfalls that we've had?
Yeah, some countries did a lot less shutdown. Some countries, so right now, for example, the Czech Republic is completely open. They had a slight increase in cases, But, I think at the end of the day, they said, we're going to see a slight increase in cases. Now, what I meant before, we don't know that much about the virus still. We don't know if there's going to be a second wave everywhere like there was in the 1960s. By the way, more people died from the Hong Kong flu in 1970 in Europe than from the first wave. The opposite was true in the United States. So we just don't know enough about that. I think that some countries just didn't shut down. Other countries shut down completely, did it very hard, very fast, like Korea. And economically, they did relatively well because their businesses stayed open.
That's a tough one. Definitely. Yeah. I know in the presentation that you gave in May, you shared a lot about, what's worse, the economic downturn that we're going to experience versus the health consequences, and where's that middle ground to finding what's right for the country.
Yeah, let me just mention one thing about that, and that is, I get to talk to a lot of our public health officials, and the first thing I told them was, if you're just going to be laser focused on cases of COVID and ICU treatment of COVID, you're really missing the larger picture. And the larger picture is that people who are unemployed for 8 months, who are losing their house, who become depressed, people who don't think there's any job possibilities, calls to suicide hotlines are up like crazy. Spousal abuse is up, child abuse is up, all those kind of things. Opioid addiction is up. All these things that come with long-term depression, those have to be monitored too. So I have told them, and we're actually working on a dashboard now for the county, that's going to have all those other things in it as well, so that we can really see what's happening to our community. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it looks like that is it for questions in the chat. Any parting words that you'd like to leave the audience with before I give some closing remarks?
No, just, like I said, I'm optimistic we're going to get back to that long run trend. Our economy is just so vibrant, so strong. Our technology is so good. Students are amazing, so, we're going to get back there. And as long as we start to see some of the right policies, come through, both medically and economically, we'll get there sooner rather than later.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. I know
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
You've been giving these presentations. People really want to know what's happening on the front lines of the economy. It's good to know that we've got good UCSB folks working on things. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your insights with everyone. And for folks on the call, thank you for joining us. I know it's a tough topic. It's a tough time for folks, so we appreciate you tuning in. Thank you for joining in, and hopefully we will see you at a couple more of these. Thanks, everyone.